This is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. Welcome. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments into whatever platform you happen to be watching on, assuming that you're watching live. And they should show up here in my chat room and we can talk directly. And I love spending this time with you. I love being able to talk directly with you this way. I hope that you're enjoying it as well. And today is Friday. It's our weekly roundup day when we look at interesting stories from the week, from the general news, or from previous episodes, and go back to them. And there are a couple of stories I have for today. And I'm going to start with one that we originally talked about a few weeks ago. Not very long ago at all. And that was the attempted bombing of the Satanic Temple in Salem, Massachusetts. And on about 2 weeks ago, this happened, and on April 17th, so a few days ago, um, it was announced that they had found the culprit who had done this, and they're from Oklahoma. And the person is Sean Patrick Palmer, 49, from Perkins, Oklahoma. And they face now a charge of using an explosive to cause damage to a building. Um, and they were apprehended on the morning of April 17th. And the reason they could be apprehended were cameras on the building. And, this is important, and it's going to be important to see what happens with it. Very often. And hello to Reverend Mary in the chat room, and hello to Reverend Brian, and hello to Renee. Um, it's going to be important to see what happens with this story because often our weekly roundups have come back to the subject of Christian dominionism or Christian nationalism, and the threat that poses to our community. How this is handled is really kind of important to the future because ideally this person should be treated like any other um, would-be arsonist, would-be terrorist, because that's really what this is. And we'll see if they are. And since our audience is primarily pagan, it is worth taking a moment to point out that this was an attack on the Satanic Temple, which is a different movement, and that this particular um, temple is um, how to describe them. Um, they're non-theistic religious and activist organization. Non-theistic means that they do not actually focus on the idea of um, the idea of Satan as such. They use it for I guess for effect, which doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. But that's their movement, their business. Um, but it is worth pointing out these are two different movements, but what happens in one can affect what happens in the other. And we've talked about the satanic panic in the past. And the difference between the two movements is one of the reasons that, for the most part, the satanic panic did not hit the Wiccan community as it might have done, or the pagan community as it might have done, because we were able to very clearly say, the people you're talking about are not us. I think those waters are a little muddier today because many people like to cross that border, for want of a better way to put it. But we'll see what happens. There are lots of signs that there's an attempt at another satanic panic underway. We'll see how it goes. Certainly, this attack um, was part of that sort of feeling. It's also, however, part of the fact that the Satanic Temple is very active socially in opposing religious persecution, which is a wonderful thing, and I highly commend them for that. From everything I can tell, this particular group is is very positive and are very much involved in supporting secular society and the future of secular society, which is vitally important to all minority religions. So that's my first story, and I'm very happy to see someone arrested for that, and I'm hoping to see it taken as seriously as it would be with an attempted bombing of any other religious institution. And we'll see where it goes. Now, another story that I wanted to talk about today is the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness. And this was recently presented at a conference at New York University. Um, and I believe last Friday morning. And it has been signed by 40 researchers. And it basically takes the position that there's strong scientific support that many birds and mammals have conscious, sentient experiences, and that it's realistically feasible that consciousness is true for all vertebrates and perhaps invertebrates as well. And, this is a huge movement forward in science. Um, it's not anything new in metaphysics. And, we've talked in previous programs about animism. And as a Corellian, I would consider myself an animist. And this is very much an animistic point of view, that everything is alive and that it all has its own kind of consciousness, even if not always the same kind of consciousness. And increasingly, science is looking at this and beginning to come to that same point of view. And um, and Reverend Mary says dogs and cats are sentient, and I think anyone who has one will readily agree. And I would add that your computer is fairly sentient as well, and I think many people who have one will have had some encounters with it to say that. But this is, in my opinion, both a step forward and in some ways a step to the side. Um, and um, one of the primary articles on the subject um, that I read from NBC News talked about how René Descartes argued that animals were merely material automata without souls or consciousness, which is certainly the traditional Christian point of view. Definitely not the animist point of view. And this is a great movement forward in that. What the reason I say it may be a bit of a step sideways is that it's only dealing with this aspect of life, but I guess you have to go one step at a time because there are also many studies, much research talking about how much more complex the lives of plants are than we once thought, how at least some plants engage in communication that we can now verify, how they have reactions that we can now verify, and that they too are not automata. Um, and in the end, from an animist point of view, it's all alive. Um, and this report certainly doesn't go that far. One of the things that I think that we often make the mistake of doing in our various religions that like to think of themselves as nature-oriented religions is that the nature that we revere is kind of the Disney version of nature. Um, and um, that is, um, I don't think, really helpful. I think we need to, if we claim that we revere nature, if we claim that we see deity in nature, which certainly is how I was raised and what I view the world through, the lens that I view the world through, then we have to see it in its complexity. It's not a bunch of happy woodland creatures playing all day in the forest. It's far more complex than that and not always quite that nice. It is a complicated web That includes things like the cycle of predation and prey, and the fact that, as I've said before, all life feeds on the death of other life, ultimately. Whether we're talking about plants or animals or microscopic what have you, um, the source of our continued nutrients, for the most part, is our previous incarnations, our previous bodies. Um, yes, there is also photosynthesis and things like that. That doesn't do anything for us. Um, and I think that we need to not give into a bowdlerized view of nature, but to see nature much more as the complex web that it is. Now, Reverend Mary says, going back to the whole material automata, the statement from Descartes, nonsense. All our animals have demonstrated intelligence and caring. And Reverend Mary means all of her personal animals. They have protected the grandkids. And yeah, I think anyone who has experience of virtually any animal will know this. Um, here in Danville, um, Sharia, who is Reverend Jason's stepdaughter, she has a bearded dragon by the name of Phoenix. It's a bearded dragon. Its head is that big. Its brain is not very large. And yet, it's clearly sentient. It's very affectionate. I didn't realize that kind of reptile could be that affectionate. It loves to cuddle and sleep with Sharia. It enjoys interaction with humans. It watches television. Um, Literally, will put itself in a position to see the television. And although I don't know exactly what its experience of that is, at the very least, it's observing the shapes and the movement and finding it interesting. Um, and this is a lizard. I know from numerous interactions with turtles and tortoises, they're far more interactive than I ever thought was possible. I used to say of Mr. Turtle in Florida that for a creature with relatively few facial muscles, he was capable of great facial expression and enjoyed interacting with people, um, and was very clearly quite intelligent. Crush, the turtle here, is clearly quite intelligent, and although um, his original person was not particularly interactive with him, Sharia has him to the point that he loves to be picked up and held and to interact with her. And, you wouldn't necessarily think that a turtle would be that way. I know from years ago when we had hamsters, um, that they can be very much affectionate pets who are very interactive in their environments. Um, the idea that they're merely any kind of automata makes no sense if you pay any attention to them at all. And it kind of makes you wonder where these people's heads were all those centuries when that's what they thought of animals. It also makes you wonder how wide a point of view it actually was, or if it was more the point of view of the intelligentsia, who maybe didn't have that much to do with animals. Because, if you look back historically, people often had very close relationships with their animals, um, just as much during the Christian era as any other, and obviously knew that they were affectionate and reactive and so forth. Um, so I'm pleased to see the science getting perhaps a little bit more aware of this, and I think even within what's left of my lifetime, that we will see a lot more research on this subject and a lot more understanding of it. And I'm hoping to see that happen both in terms of animals and in terms of plants. The one thing that this won't give, however, is a simple answer to how to interact with the world because it's simply not simple. Um, I think that it will always be a complex interaction between, well, between any species, but in particular between humankind and animals and plants of all sorts. And Reverend Mary says, I wonder how anyone who worked with horses could doubt their intelligence. And I was thinking very much the same thing. Um, and that's why I do wonder if that was as widespread a point of view as it's often claimed, or if that was a doctrinal point of view that certain people held. And I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, not coming from that background. And I have to say that I grew up in an era when I would have thought that was the more common point of view, though it was certainly changing. And I can remember a few people expressing it, but I really wasn't asking people from other religious backgrounds what their point of view was at that point in time. I did notice a lot of people expressing offense at the idea that animals did not have intelligence or did not have souls. Um, but I, again, can't really say how wide a point of view that really was. I'm sure that there are those who can. I've never looked at it. But I don't think it's going to be a wide point of view in the future. And I think that's for the best. And what does that mean to us? And like I say, what I don't think it means is a simple answer in how to interact with the world. Um, some people would like to make it a very simple answer. And, wouldn't it be great if all the questions in our life had simple answers? But they don't. Um, but I do think we can reach a more humane answer, and I would hope that we do so. And, I am not a supporter of the sentiment that the domestication of animals was in any way a wrong thing. I think in many cases it was mutual. I do think that we have often, as humans, departed from our end of the bargain. And when we look at dogs and cats, the current wisdom, I believe, is that they domesticated themselves, or arguably they domesticated us as much as we domesticated them. In the case of cats, well, in case of both of them, we were a source of food, and they found that instead of hunting um, in competition with us, they could live with us and hunt with us, and it worked out beautifully for them for the most part. And I think that's probably true for a lot of what would become domesticated animals. But I don't know that all of them are getting their share of the bargain at this point in time. I think for the most part, dogs and cats certainly do. Um, I can think of a couple of puppies downstairs who are definitely getting the better part of their bargain. And but again, it's not a simple answer. And Christine says, I believe the relationship is mutual. That's my point of view as well. I think it was always mutual. I think it still is, but I think in some cases it's become unbalanced, and that we really need to work on rebalancing, particularly how we manage um, the animals that we consume. And I don't know that I consider it a bad thing to have been, let's say, a chicken being raised under traditional circumstances, even though in the end you were likely to be eaten, although they weren't always. But they had a good life until they got there, and I can see why, karmically speaking, that could have been a good arrangement. But with our present industrial farming techniques, I don't know that I think that it is. But I think the answer to that is to adjust our behavior. Um, to make it more humane and more reasonable. We'll see if we're capable of that. And the little pagan that could says a symbiotic relationship between humans and animals beyond domesticated house pets is incredibly difficult in a modern world removed from our own agriculture. Absolutely. And the answer to how best to deal with these things is not in any way simple, and belongs to the next generation, and we'll see what they do with it. Um, my generation did try to make some improvements, and in certain circles did so, but I think in other areas things only became worse, and we'll see. We'll see what happens in that incredibly difficult relationship. And when time comes to reincarnate, and I return to this world, I'll see how far we got, or if we got far at all. Um, but one of I talk sometimes about channels I follow on Instagram. One of the ones I've been following is called Nomadic Family, and it's about a Mongol family, um, and how they live in a traditional nomadic lifestyle. And it's quite fascinating. Um, and it certainly reveals a very different sort of relationship to their domesticated animals. And Christine says, I love how the movie Avatar shows respect slash disrespect between species. And as we deal more with the fact that everything is alive, everything has its own sort of consciousness, we're going to have to deal with that aspect of respect and disrespect between species. And to some extent, I believe that older idea of animals and plants as material automata was basically just a way to psychologically avoid the difficulty of dealing with that subject while continuing to live in this world. I also think that is part of the Disneyfication or Balderization of nature. I think they are both simplistic ways of denying a complex situation. Because when we acknowledge its complexity, we also acknowledge that there are things we must do, um, rather than either A, continuing as we are, or B, pretending we're going to throw it all out and then continuing as we are. Um, and I think that these are things that, as we go forward, we're going to need to look at. And we as pagans, in particular, need to look at this. And one of the reasons is that we claim that nature is so very important to us. We teach that nature is so very important to us. So, how we're interacting with nature and how we're dealing with it as we go into the future must be important to us, or we're simply hypocrites. Um, now, having said that, what to do remains a complex situation, particularly on an individual level. And as the little pagan that could points out, most of us are very far removed from our own agriculture. At best, we may have a garden. There are very few people who are still on farms of any kind. Um, we may go to things like farmers markets. Hello to Zane in the chat room. It's good to see you, Zane. We may, like I say, we may have a garden that will give us some interaction, but it doesn't affect industrial agriculture. And most people not only are not in that situation, but of having any more interaction than that, but really cannot be because of the places and ways that they live. Although I would love to see, and for a few years felt very hopeful about, an increase in urban agriculture. Urban agriculture, I think, offers so much for the future. Um, in the first edition of the Pagan News program that we showed a few weeks ago, Chris Copeland was talking about guerrilla agriculture, which is an aspect of urban agriculture. And I think that turning abandoned lots into gardens, that having things like vertical farms in urban areas, um, things like this, I think, are vitally important to the future for a variety of reasons, including that they're one way that people can take a much more direct role in the production of their own food. And today, if we look at farms in the United States, most of them are either owned by large industrial landowners or by relatively wealthy farm families. Because for the most part, poor farmers have been forced out long ago. And the little pagan that could says, yes, doing so much research on vertical hydroponics and aquaponics right now. I think that's very important to the future. I think we make a huge mistake if we don't pursue that heavily. But I also have to say, I've watched people make a lot of mistakes in my lifetime, especially people in government and in positions to make these decisions. When we were talking about the lustration the other day and how the last double investiture was in 1979. And you know what was happening in 1979? We were looking at all kinds of alternative fuel sources. Solar energy was hugely important. Many other things were under development. And at that point, the government was in favor of all these things. Within just a few years, they'd all be totally sabotaged. And only small amounts of that did we actually see come into use. Um, so, yeah, just because something is the logical choice doesn't mean it's what people are going to do. And there are certain powers in society which seem to be completely dependent or completely focused only on keeping things as they are. I'm not even going to say focused on their profits, because in a lot of cases, they could make just as much or more profit from modernizing to new ideas, but they don't seem capable of the change. One of the things um, that I read the other day on the subject of climate change, do you know the first person um, who seems to have noticed this and written about it, and what year it was? Let me see if I can find that story. Here it is. The first person to write about this, after doing a series of experiments, was Eunice Newton Foote, a scientist and women's rights campaigner from Seneca Falls, New York, and she wrote about it in 1856. That's how long we've known that certain industrial processes were having a negative effect on our environment. And only much more recently has there been any attempt at all to do anything about it. And for the most part, pretty small attempts. And people fighting it every step of the way because I guess a polluted world is part of their identity. Um, Use of fossil fuels is part of their identity. Coal mining is part of their identity. And I don't quite know what to say for this, except that people don't always pay attention to what they should pay attention to. We are people, it's part of our nature. But I hope that as we forward, future generations will pay a little more attention. With that, I see we've come to the end of our half hour. I hope that you have enjoyed it. I hope that you will join me again next week for Midday with Reverend Don. And let us now close with our prayer, as we always do. And Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives. And we ask you to continue to be with us and guide us as we go forward. Help us to be mindful of the world in which we live and the effect of our actions on that world and the effect of that world on us. Help us to build healthier and better lives in this and future incarnations. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and thanks, knowing you are always with us, but from respect. We thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence. May you be blessed now and always. And I'll see you on Monday.